Good evening and welcome to this third and final day of the Global Energy Summit at LBS. After exploring the challenges of the energy transition on Monday and discovering how the energy transition will happen in the Middle East, tonight we will explore two key technologies that will play a crucial role as enablers: distributed solar and storage technology. Tonight we have Miguel from EDP, Anshul from BBOXX, and Vlasios from Lightsource BP. Before we start, some housekeeping. Should you have any question along the session, please share them with the Q&A function. We'll send them to the panel. Now let me introduce you to Ben Grunfeld, who will moderate the discussion. He is a partner in the Global Energy, Sustainability and Infrastructure segment, the European and Middle Eastern utility and energy company sector leader at Guidehouse. He is a trusted advisor to senior leaders across the entire energy sector value chain and a recognized expert globally. He holds a Bachelor in Applied Mathematics and Engineering from Queen's University and a Master's in Management and Economics from LSE. Thank you very much, Ben. The floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Alberto. First goal accomplished. I was able to turn on video and audio. Hopefully, you guys can hear me. Wonderful. First of all, just thank you to the organizers, right, for arranging the session this evening, for inviting me. Guidehouse is probably a new name to a lot of folks. It's a company that's about a year old, but has very deep roots. It was formed when Navigant was merged with the public sector practice at PwC in the US. I lead, as Alberto said, I lead our energy, sustainability, and infrastructure teams in Europe and the Middle East that work with energy companies up and down the value chain in the energy sector, from regulated utilities to independent power producers and retailers. With me this evening are three very distinguished speakers who have an incredible depth and expertise when it comes to distributed solar technologies and the market around distributed solar. They come from different backgrounds, different places. Their organizations approach the topic in different ways, and I think we'll have a really interesting conversation as we get into some of the details and we start to hear and see those different perspectives come to light. First, let me introduce Miguel. Miguel's the commercial director and board member at EDP Spain, a former partner in McKinsey's Lisbon office. He's worked for clients in several industries, including telecom, media, banking, utilities, and manufacturing, and projects ranging from strategy to organization and corporate finance. Holds an undergraduate degree in business administration and an MBA from INSEAD. Anshul is a director of global partnerships at BBOXX, a next generation utility providing pay-as-you-go access to energy for over 300,000 homes in Africa through distributed solar energy systems. BBOXX impacts over 1 million underserved people, benefit from clean, reliable, and affordable electricity. Anshul's role is to drive growth through strategic partnerships, and he has 10 years of rapid commercial growth experience in frontier markets. Career originated through graduate program at Rolls-Royce, followed by performance engineering on the Trent XWB program. Anshul has a master's degree in aeronautical engineering from Imperial College and is a keen motorcyclist, as I understand. So you can ask him about that as well. And finally, Vlasios, who's been at Lightsource BP since its startup years and currently heads up the international business development function, responsible for the selection, market entry, planning, and execution of projects or platforms in new markets, as well as strategic projects undertaken with BP. Before joining Lightsource BP, Vlasios worked in fund management and financial advisory for renewable energy projects in OECD markets, as well as managing a carbon fund for non-OECD markets. He studied physics in Greece and holds an MBA from Bocconi in London Business School. So please, join me in welcoming our panel. I'll ask them to turn on their video and share their screens. The intention is to engage in a fairly lively dialogue, hopefully stimulating lots of commentary and feedback from the audience as we go. I certainly have some pre-selected questions to get things started, but definitely send through questions as we go in the chat, and the Alberto and the team from the Global Energy Summit will make sure that they get their way to me, and then I can get them through to the panelists. So maybe just a softball to kick things off with the group, and maybe starting with you, Miguel, having worked across a number of sectors and industries. When within EDP and coming from a sort of more traditional utility background, when did distributed solar really start to be a priority for EDP and prioritized as a source of energy and growth for the organization?
First of all, thank you for the invite and the opportunity, and thank you, Ben, for the intro and the question. Actually, EDP, in spite of being an incumbent, right now the incumbent market, the old traditional integrated player is long gone. Since, I don't know, 2005, EDP has established itself in the renewables at utility scale. So it's among the top 3 player in wind renewables and quite a sizable player, but at utility scale. And I think that, talking now about distributed generation, I think that it started to come as a topic driven by supply, so on the retail side of the business, not on the generation side. And it was something that started growing with clients and energy. Now, I think that we are at the time when large players, even in the utility scale, probably like, I don't know, BP in Lightsource or any utility scale player, when looking forward between 2020 and 2030, distributed generation installed capacity will account for 30% of new additions coming into the renewables market. So if you want to establish yourself, if you want to achieve, significant growth, if you need to deploy capex, you cannot discredit or you cannot underlook, what will be 30% of the market in the next 10 years. So anticipating that a little bit, I think that since 2016, 2015, EDP started deploying assets on distributed generation. It's in fact a different business. It entails scattering the installation, clients being more exposed to risk, to counterparty risk. It entails, orientating all your, customer lifecycle processes from billing to performance management of the contract to asset management, with a different focus and a different strategy vis-a-vis the utility scale business. So I think that it will be a very relevant business line within renewables, new flow coming into the market in the next 10 years. I think that it entails some differentiating assets and knowledge that I think either you have them and you're right position, you are in a good position to participate in the market, or you might be coming late. And we have recognized that throughout the next 5 years, the market will plateau. So the amount of new additions in distributed generation for the next 5 years up until 2025 globally will be about the same that from 2025 to 2030. So the market has grown a lot, has grown quite rapidly, and actually the time is now. It will not be in 5 years. So for us, it has become quite central in our strategy. Actually, EDP is announcing is having its Capital Markets Day with the new board tomorrow. So, next week it will be quite public, the investment we're making for the next 5 years. And this DGE will be part of the business, of course. Thank you, Ben.
No, thank you. And maybe to you, Vlasios, sort of coming at it from almost the other end of the spectrum, initially a small startup, now no longer I think could be classified as such, but you're sort of starting in the distributed solar world effectively, and sort of having your roots. Maybe talk us a bit through some of the early days in Lightsource and sort of what drew the company to the distributed solar market, and sort of what you see as the sort of the strengths that keep you there going forward.
Sure. Thank you, Ben, and thanks, LBS, for hosting us for this interesting conversation. So I would say that distribution solar is probably also a definition question. I think Miguel described it perfectly well. It's going to be quite a big market. I'll just give one more element from a market perspective, that Vietnam had 9 gigawatts, for example, of distributed solar in 1 year. So you can see the amount of solar being actually installed in 1 year in an area that is pretty much up and coming and was not there before. So that we will see that in all the countries around the world. But the definition of distributed solar usually has 2 definitions, if I may say. One is small scale. So generally small scale, 5 megawatts and lower projects that either are in feed-in tariffs or are going directly to where the demand is required, or rooftops or something like that. Or distributed generation in the sense of actually generating where the demand requires it. And I think that's the distributed generation that probably drives us, and I think that's the one that probably Miguel mentions as well. So Lightsource started from small projects, which somebody would call distributed generation. So we had 5 to 6 megawatt projects, 300 of them in 3 to 4 years only in the UK. But that was driven, the size was driven purely because of incentives. So you had feed-in tariffs and ROCs and all that. So we were kind of capped onto how big our projects could be in order to actually get those incentives. But once we left the UK and we went outside, there's all kinds of different models in terms of distributed generation, and you can have energy communities, for example, which is something that is being introduced in Europe, and you have all kinds of incentives for local investors for their local demand to create a local plant to generate electricity for it. But also you can have distributed generation in the sense of building a massive plant next to a power factory. An example would be the Vraz steel mills in Colorado, where we have a 200 plus megawatts project next to it, or in Pennsylvania, Penn State University, where we have another corporate PPA there. So it's kind of statewide, you could say, because you can build somewhere else in the state and sell the electricity, or you can build it right next to it. But the concept is that solves a problem. Building the capacity next to the demand solves a problem because you need less infrastructure investment. Your generation is basically consumed on site, and of course you have to check what kind of profile of generation you're giving to the customer, what kind of profile of consumption they have, and then add perhaps different profiles. You can combine solar and wind, you can put storage on the back of it, so as to make sure that whatever's generated there is actually consumed there. So it's definitely a big market, definitely something that we're looking at, and it's part of our business model across the geographies we operate in.
Excellent, and we'll talk a bit more. I think we'll dive into the topic of kind of evolving business models and how the business models are shifting as incentives and subsidy support and all those things shift from market to market. But just before we get there, maybe Anshul, BBOXX, very much focused in the African market. You kind of your background and history in the African market. A different starting place, right? Certainly, can quite frankly, you can see and very, I think, intuitively understand a business case for distributed solar, but maybe sort of talk us through your company and your sort of focus around it and what drove that and sort of what keeps you in it.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Again, first of all, thanks for having this session, the RBS team. And I'd like to add one more definition to Vlasios, which is actually that you also have the idea of a distributed utility, which BBOXX is positioned as. And that actually is about addressing the, depending on which statistic you read, 800 million to 1 billion who are actually either without access to electricity from the grid, or actually maybe even the slightly further, the 2 billion that probably have inadequate access, right? So they're under the grid, they've got brown grids, etc. And that obviously makes up the problem in most parts of Africa, a lot of Asia as well, in different stretches. So giving you a flavor of where we are, our business today is built on selling on pay-as-you-go models, systems from 20 watts consisting of panels and batteries that are generating power right at the customer's homes. and that we're remotely monitoring and managing, and through digital payments for on very small micro payment basis from each one of our customers. The challenge for us is obviously the grid didn't exist in these areas, and the grid actually, in the case of many African countries, many Asian countries, is not going to economically exist in these areas for a long time to come. So what you've seen over the last 10 years or so is a huge shift from having this pro-grid extension policy to saying, right, we need the grid, and we actually need mini grids and smaller solutions that actually address a community problem. And then actually, even on top of that, we need to recognize that solar home systems are actually going right out to the last mile where, you know, neither of these other two solutions make economic sense. So I think this is around the least cost electrification method. And this is becoming an increasing part of government's policy, which we've been spearheading a lot as well. And for us, it's important to recognize that the economics are severely challenged, right? And it requires many things to come together, which is what makes it interesting for us. It's not just the product, it's not just the quality, it's the availability of mobile payments, it's a credit control management with our consumers, it's actually finding the right type of scalable financing, and actually getting the policy pieces into place, and also getting subsidies into place, right? One thing that has been very hard to please our investor folk until recently is the idea that these businesses could survive without subsidies, but the grid used to be subsidized or still get subsidized, right? And I think there's global recognition that subsidies need to exist. And now there are plans to make this more uniform, and clearly being part of the recognized the electrification strategy for a country. So yeah, we start off quite small, actually really small in the sense of the colleagues on this call. And I'd also like to point out that distributed solar actually started from a necessity. I think probably the earliest sort of records probably predate late 90s, but definitely the pioneer here was actually Bangladesh. With the Grameen Foundation and Grameen Shakti as an organization that spearheaded this concept of getting small solar systems out to consumers and getting micropayments from them. And that sin has really developed in Africa a lot more over the last few years.
Very interesting. Thanks, Anshul. Maybe just talking a bit about cost and trajectories. Obviously, we've seen panel costs decline incredibly over the last decade, 15 years. We've seen that start to impact balance of plant costs as well, and other big drivers of total installed cost. Do you, as and I'll sort of throw this out to the panel and see who wants to take a first stab at it. Do you see that continuing going forward? Do you see the same, obviously, or same level of cost declines going forward? Do you see other factors stepping in? What's your view on cost trajectory and sort of future competitiveness of distributed solar?
Glad to take a stab at it if the others are happy with it. The general trend is definitely downwards, and in terms of a per megawatt installed solar per megawatt installed capacity. The trend is basically for a number of reasons. So you have technological advancement like the bifacial modules increasing the efficiency by 20-23%. You have better manufacturing process, which reduces waste, therefore reduces the cost of the production. You have bigger modules, so you have less labor cost in the installation of it. So you have a number of reasons why solar will have the downward trend. But on the way there, there is a number of bumps, and that's usually driven by two things. The first one would be regulation. So you have, for example, tariffs imposed in the US on Chinese panels. You have a similar potential with the Xinjiang province, with the Uyghurs, and the EU potentially providing for sanctions on that province, which has 51% of the raw material, which is polysilicon, of the global raw material production. So that's one. And then you have demand and supply issues that are constantly coming up where either supply is not enough for the demand, or the demand expands massively and then the prices go up. An example again would be before a year or year and a half, there was an extension of the Chinese tariffs, and therefore all that capacity that was produced there would stay in country. Therefore, the prices increase for everybody else. Or you can have supply side issues like a very recent and actually current raw material production issue that increases the price of the panels from supply side because there's just not enough raw material for everybody to produce. So downward trend, definitely. A number of reasons why there will be spikes on the way there, and we're actually living one today.
Yeah, if I can add on top, I think that the trend is there as it's almost a universal law. I think that, as you say, and just to give some color into what Vlasios was talking about in terms of disruption right now, actually, and impacting some biddings that we're doing, the transport to China, just the transport, because there are no containers are going empty back to China. So cost of transport has gone up and has placed panels again back 6 months in price. So the glide path is interrupted by very, small impacts on the value chain, but as you know, has a deep impact. What I like also on distributed generation, and we talk a lot, of course, about the components and the electronic components that are a huge part on the costs, and actually in the past played a pivotal role. I think that distributed generation is also dependent on other factors that can accelerate the economic eligibility of this product for various clients. And I was writing here some stuff that has impacted quite deeply the economics that you can present to a client. One of which is, of course, the local energy communities that for B2C companies, for small and medium businesses, by sharing infrastructure, because you can build larger scale, you can make a, a usage of the network in advantageous conditions depending on the country. It changes the economics so that, the market keeps expanding into companies that would have an economic incentive to bring in. Apart from these regulatory type of changes, I believe that also the players in the market and all the pressure around competition also pushes for innovation in business models. And so you have all the type of leasing and financing models. You have more flexibility to adopt and take on risk from the client. So go from pay as produced models to pay as consumed models, and get the operator of the solar panels, even within the installation for auto consumption, to manage this risk for the client. And so I believe that one, yes, costs are coming down. They'll be now and then interrupted, but of course they'll keep coming down and making a larger eligible market. Regulation and innovation around business models, namely on financing and managing risks, will greatly enhance and expand the eligible market for distributed generation.
And maybe I'll throw in something slightly on a different shift. Of course, I think there will be a saturation point on these prices, and market factors will determine, that volatility that Miguel was describing. But for us, actually, the panel prices are perhaps one of the smaller cost components in comparison to Miguel and Vlasios, because firstly, we're not dealing in the same sort of megawatt volume, at least on a project basis, right? Our systems are much smaller in capacity and size. But what I wanted to point out for us is the battery prices actually, and the battery tech is important. That's actually seeing a significant shift, which is really good for us. But the cost of delivery of service, right? The finance, the sort of team cost, and the cost of quality, etc., to achieve solutions at scale in ground. That really is for us one of the big things. I mean, digital payments, to give you an example, when we started off in Rwanda, we were charged about 3% per transaction that came through for our micro payments, which is actually a lot when you're looking at really thin margins. In Kenya, we're down to 0.5%. So I think there's going to be a lot of shift on those kind of activities for us. But also in terms of the quality and service, if you imagine having to go out to a customer probably 50 kilometers away from the nearest sort of town, who's probably another 3 or 4 hours away from the capital, you can start seeing how these costs can add up quite quickly for us on an operating basis. So I thought I'd just share that. It's a slight shift from probably just talking about the product cost. It's actually all the other ancillaries that make up that unit.
Yeah, no, great point, Anshul. So, we heard Vlasios talk about the sort of the technology, the panel inverter kind of main components. Miguel talked a bit about supply chain business model, right, impacting. And then I think, Anshul, you sort of flagged the piece around, balance of plant installation costs sort of, and it is a full, it's a full picture that ultimately presents the competitiveness of the technology in a given location and with a particular customer. So kind of great kind of rounding out of the picture, and it's all of those things that ultimately drive cost. Maybe just shifting a little bit to business model and sort of the evolution of the business model for distributed solar. Miguel, you talked about sort of community energy systems as sort of an emerging business model. Vlasios, you mentioned earlier, the notion of kind of moving from feed-in tariffs and sort of rec procurement to sort of direct near site or on site models. Where do you see the business model for distributed solar? And maybe it is an OECD versus sort of non-OECD question, but do you see, what do you see as sort of the major changes, facing companies when it comes to, the evolution of the business model for this technology?
I'm happy to share part of it, hopefully. The problem with distributed solar, so you can build a massive solar plant and basically win an auction and deliver the energy that you have promised to deliver. The problem with distributed solar is that you have to match the profiles if you really want to talk about generating where you're actually consuming, and that's not an easy thing to do. First of all, you have the obvious problem where you generate at a time that the sun is up. And it doesn't mean that the factories or whoever else you're giving the energy to are not working in the night. So you have to solve that. Then you have to solve the fact that if you truly want to be located next to it, you need to have available land. Then on top of that, the land needs to be basically priced at a nice way in order for economics to work. The legislation needs to allow for that to happen. The regulation around grid connections need to work. And that takes a lot of work because you start from the customer and then you start trying to identify what's the plot of land to do it. And then you start working on developing that plot of land. That also takes time in terms of the development process. So you have 12 to 36 months, let's say, because you start from the client, you don't have the land, and then you start with the land. And the process of permitting, environment, and making deals with the landlords, the transmission lines, grid connection, all that take a lot of time. So distributed with a pure sense of it, which is generate where I consume, is quite complicated. What though can complement that, and I think that's something that's going that direction, and we're already doing projects like that, is to basically generate and use the grid in order to sell the electricity to the customers through the grid. So you pay a fee to use the grid and you do that way. And that helps you to identify better land. So it doesn't mean that the factory where it consumes is the best place to do solar, but you can really give them a better price because you can make a bigger plant somewhere else. And then through the grid, which is a wheeling contract, sell to them wherever they are. But again, it depends from country to country and legislation to legislation and how would that work with the regulations at any given time. Regulation not just around the grid connection, but also if it's allowed to actually have you have a liberated energy market to allow to have contracts like that. But I think that is something that we will be seeing quite a lot. And as I said before, the shaping of the energy profile is becoming even more important. So you will not be selling electricity just as you generate, which was the main thing up to now. It's more about shaping your generation profile, adding wind in the nighttime so that it looks more like a baseload power, adding storage where it's required. And in fact, in terms of storage, we see that in the US in particular, where the grid is quite more advanced, where utility in particular customers ask us to also have storage in our solution. So when we sell a power purchase agreement, we include capacity for storage as well in our offering.
Yes. So, I mean, the way I look into the business model, and I think it's quite different. I'll just share my perspective as we learn and plan ahead on how to deliver on growth. I think that the model is super simple, and as Vlasios was saying, I think that commonly now distributed generation is about design on site for auto consumption behind the meter. Things that can enable advances on the business model are much focused on how can we make it more profitable, more economic to have this plant running. And how can people have easier access to it? So I see an evolution of the business model in some, let's say, degrees. One, as I was saying, was about shared infrastructure. So anytime, in an industrial, industrial compounds, where you have multiple tenants from the same source using a local network, to residential communities, sharing is definitely an axis of economics and changes on the business model. Towards renting, towards lower term contracts because you have multiple tenants, so you can see the impact that it can have on the economic model. A second is, utilities were ill, I would say, they are used to very sure feed-in tariff type of deals that I don't know if you know what they are, but basically, regulated incomes with very low risk, stable platform of growth. More and more clients are demanding to not take on the risk of volume of consumption, of indexing to price. So contracts and the providers of this type of services are trying to manage for clients this type of risk. So instead of paying for, I will not pay for produce or for the plant, I want to pay only for what I consume. So injections into the grid and management of risk, volume risk, price risk of the asset is something that will also evolve on the business model, I would say. And last but not the least, you have also all the financing. So you see either from green deals, green pacts, from banks and other financial institutions, private equities want to all these type of assets. There is a myriad of sources of financing. You need to put them together and bundle them into a product that mitigates risk for investors, maximizes value for holders of the plant. So all this together kind of shaking, plus the price of the market makes the model evolve. And so if it puts batteries on or not, what is the ideal size? I think it's a market under heavy evolution and a lot of innovation actually on the business model front.
Excellent. Anshul, anything different from a non-OECD country perspective?
Not really. I think, sorry, I was typing away at some of the questions. So would you mind just rephrasing or summarizing that question again? So
really just evolution of the business model, and
okay.
do you see any major shifts, or is it more kind of evolution or revolution when it comes to the next 5 years?
Yeah, so we coined our business tagline as the solar revolution in the early days. So definitely a revolution in what we were trying to do, first of all. And in that, we've had some evolutions as well, right? So just going back probably 10 years when we first started, pay-as-you-go was new for us. And actually, we started actually doing sales on cash, and we realized that people can't afford things. So that led to a 6-month credit term and and to a service model, right? So BBOXX, as I said, we positioned ourselves as a utility co, but we have this sort of constant battle between what is service and what is ownership, because some of these products that we sell and serve, I mean, energy has always been a service. It's not really a product, right? And we don't think that's going to change. But for us, what we've been having to think about quite strongly is this balance between an ownership, which is perceived to be quite important in the case of our consumers, who are actually, unfortunately not in the most educated of states, right? I mean, they have, they're impoverished by many means, but nonetheless, they're quite, savvy and trying to be quite careful with their money. So we've had to balance this thing about saying, we have a long-term product and a quality, offer to them, but actually at the same time presenting it as a service and showing that these products are here to stay for them and will be serviced by us as a business, right? And that's one of the most important things for us as BBOXX, that we know we need to manage these products over its lifetime. And typically, like a lead acid battery, you'd be lucky to get about 18 months out of it. And in the case of lithium, we're seeing we can potentially get 5 years or so. So I think that's been one big shift in sort of the thinking about the service culture. And for our consumers in Africa and Asia, that's particularly important. I think the other thing to mention is that there's actually quite a lot of things around the pay-as-you-go business model that are being shared, both in developed markets and developing markets, right? So two things in particular: smart metering or prepaid metering in grids, purely from the economics of and the management of cash and cash losses in grids. 47 or 49 out of Africa's utilities are not making money. They're not profitable. So there's only 2 in Africa that seem to make a profit, and even that depends how you look at it and what your accounting metrics look like, right? For you clever folks out there, I think you know what it means. So I think that's one thing. But the second thing, which I think is something that's being an innovation driven out from our sector, is the idea of financing of appliances through the utilities, which is something that's actually quite new in Europe. But from our perspective, our products are sold with appliances because, one is the generation and the other one's where do you use it, right? And they need to come hand in hand. Our consumers don't have that. So we've done that from the day one. We had to do that. But what I've seen quite interesting, which I see as a lot of synergies, is I think it was a Swedish utility startup recently, and I think some in the UK are starting to do on-bill financing of appliances to their consumers. So I think there's a business model shift in that perspective, right? Like not necessarily about charging and making a margin and earning a revenue through the sale of energy, but maybe through the appliances that you're complementing through that. So yeah, definitely a shift there.
Excellent. So we're getting towards the end. Maybe one question for each of you, and then we can kind of look to close out. Outside of your own organizations, right? Who do you see in the market as being sort of truly innovative in this space? Are there maybe companies that you see as sort of being your toughest competitors, or you see them as being truly innovative and doing something unique and different? Obviously, all 3 of your companies match that description, but outside of your 3.
Yeah, I'll take a stab first, if that's okay. I mean, our space has seen a lot of companies come in. I mean, when I started my business in Kenya, it was probably a handful of sector players. There's now over 28 off-grid companies, and then a handful of mini-grid companies, and so on and so forth. I think there are probably 2 or 3 places which are quite interesting. Firstly, utilities in Africa innovating and combining their business with businesses like ours, which has not traditionally happened so far. I think the second is, which I find interesting, is actually watching the EV space closely, how the links between the sort of need and capacity for EV demand rather is being complemented by sort of innovative business models that are sort of looking at the power side as well, and really looking at it as almost like a utility, right? As well. So I think those 2 probably strike me the most. And maybe the third is a couple of companies that I've seen who are really focused on the sort of the management of flow of energy between different products and services, right? I'm not quite sure what they're called in Europe, but again, similar to our sector, it's about energy management and sort of peer-to-peer energy sharing. Again, I don't really know what the business model will look like at the end. I think people are still figuring it out. But there's some really interesting concepts that are sort of connecting the dots between various energy forms to serve customers.
Yeah, if I may comment, I think that in B2B, innovation is much around the vectors I was saying, so much less exciting. And I think that all the big players are much, more or less on level, and I think that they all cater to all these aspects that I was saying. I think that on B2C side is where I see most of the real innovators and these companies really making rounds that, when we look and we find them, it's hard to replicate because the channels are super fragmented, and that's one. So you see a lot of innovation around channels. Right now, Otovo, that is a player from Norway, has done the IPO. Their idea is around making a marketplace where they have no installers. They have like an inverted auction, and basically they create a marketplace for installers and they kind of intermediate that. At least that was the idea. So you see some business models around channels, and I think Otovo could be one in Europe. I think that in the US, they have been very successful, and there's also a German player, I cannot recall now the name, around for B2C managing the risk of leasing. So basically doing long-term leases on the equipment. So basically meaning that you do a 20-year contract with a B2C client, which is something that you need to learn how to master these risks. So how to finance it, how to master the churn and the design of the product and the finance structure to be able to make it. And when you crack the codes, both on channels in B2C and on the economics through, for example, a leasing that basically makes you come in from the start making savings with with a contract that does not look daunting, I think it's something that is really changing the game. And last but not least, we see a lot of community, small plays across Europe in all markets where we are, very small companies that basically do some crowdsourcing, crowdfunding for local energy communities and build them on their own. And this type of grassroots initiatives, of course, they do not get the scale, but they are rather innovative, and where you get these players making sense out of, quite an heavy regulatory and legal framework, and making products and bringing products to market, which I think is also quite energizing.
Not sure if you want me to add something. I think it's been covered pretty nicely by the other two participants, co-panelists. So the only thing I'll say is that in terms of investment, though, for those companies, there's multiple around them, and in each country usually have their own regulatory regime around distributed generation and people capitalizing on that. But usually those companies are private. It's going to be a little bit hard to get the true innovators through investment before a big guy snaps them up.
Yes. So maybe just to close out, as this is an event organized by a business school, and we have three very esteemed panelists, any career advice for folks interested in the distributed solar or the distributed energy market and opportunities in general? Vlasios, maybe go first.
Sure, happy to do that. I'm smiling because this thing takes more comments than what I'm saying, but that's fine. I would say there is going to be tremendous growth in this sector for the coming years. So it's a sector that definitely will create work. The question is if there is the right fit, and the right fit doesn't necessarily mean to look for salaries and all that stuff. The main thing to search is first knowledge. Do I learn something from what I'm going to do? So you want to be at a place that you're going to get these new skill sets for that, for this new era, let's say this new industry for renewables. So get to places where you can shore that up. The second thing is responsibility. So after you get to know new stuff, be responsible for the outcome of whatever you do, good or bad, because both things come in and you have to own up to them. And then the third thing I would say is salary, but the salary always follows the other two. So knowledge and responsibility, I would say.
I'm not sure I heard the question, but it has to do how to pick the right place to work, I guess, no?
Yeah, and tips, career advice for folks interested in this space.
I just wanted to share, and sorry to go, Anshul, but I just made a decision. I was for 20 years in McKinsey, so it was quite, and for those 20, I was 18 years thinking about leaving. I never made up my mind. I used to work a lot in telecom, in marketing and sales, did some utility work in the last about 3 years. And actually what I can say is that it's a brilliant sector to be in at the moment. A lot of changes is coming. I think that when looking into, how to look into a career change, at least for me, it's, as Vlasios was talking, around learning. If I'm learning, I'm motivated. If you're stretching yourself, I mean, that's what gives me energy. And I think that the energy sector globally, I think it's under a huge acceleration, a lot of investment. It's a hot sector, a lot of technology disruption, a lot of regulatory disruption. And I think that brings, of course, excitement and some dynamism that to the table that I'm sure that will motivate you into working into the job. Second, I think that there is also for the engineers out there and for the non-engineers, I think it's a super nice culture and environment where you always have this clash between, a very strict engineering part optimizing, then, the commercial management part, and then someone, trying to manage risk of investment. So the dynamics are super, I think, healthy. And I think it's a super sector to work right now. And I'm just sharing why I picked it. As Vlasios was saying, check if you're going to learn, check if you have space to fail and move on. So I would go for some scale, but I'm risk averse. So I rather, have the size and have an organization that has the size, for you to learn with it. And last but not the least, of course, that you can, live independently and happy on how you see fit in terms of salary and location.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with Vlasios and Miguel. There's a huge range of opportunities. I'm kind of reflecting back on sort of my foray from aerospace to what I'm doing today. I would like to say that the challenge is probably as high as it was in trying to make things fly as it is to try and make electrification happen around the world in a sustainable manner. I definitely think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there's things that are growing, but I'll probably throw a few pieces of advice from my perspective. I think being bold and brave and sort of ambitious are quite core to them. I think from my perspective, if I look at what happens in developing markets, there's a lot of brain drain. So for those of you who have come out to study in Europe and the Americas, or have had that exposure in the UK, do think about what you can do when if you're from one of these countries that is in this developed market sort of context. There's a lot of opportunities. You have the right skill sets and probably the network to build some really creative solutions. So I really encourage, to reduce the brain drain through that process. Your countries would definitely need you. So there's a big call to action there about going home. And, as the others say, it's not necessarily about the salary. It's about creating a sustainable future, but actually doing something impactful in the process. And there's tons and tons of opportunities for that, right? So I think that's one big thing. The second is actually to be creative in the sense that there are so many ways of doing the business opportunities as well. And that, I think there's a lot of learnings that can be applied. I think there's just sort of a very natural way to go back. And I think you'd find a lot of companies like BBOXX and others willing to take on parties or actually to be creating ventures for yourselves, which solve a small problem, but one that can actually be scaled in many ways and forms, right? So I think there's an adventurous part to a lot of us here as well in sort of a career journey, which I think you shouldn't take to note. And what's been really exciting for me is that, we've done some cool things, but actually we've met some really cool people and interacted with some very interesting businesses along the way, right? And I think there's a lot of connections that you can make from Europe into the developing world.
Excellent. Well, we're almost out of time. Just a big thank you again to Vlasios, Miguel, Anshul for your time tonight. Very insightful comments. I think we got to, in some form or another, most of the questions in the Q&A. The panelists were busy responding in the background, and then we took a couple of them head on. Thank you for all the participants. We had, I think, about 130 on it at peak, 140 at the peak. And with that, I will turn the floor back over to Gordon.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to what is sadly the last session in this year's Global Energy Summit. My name is Gordon. I'm an MBA student at London Business School. I'm one of the event organisers. And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce you to our fantastic moderator, Nathan Niese. Nathan is a partner with BCG in the electrification and climate change practices. He works with clients from Fortune 500 companies through to private equity, helping them grow their strategies and do cost transformation. Nathan has a PhD in naval architecture and marine engineering, and also a master's in sustainable systems. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Nathan to kick off tonight's proceedings. Nathan, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for the intro, Gordon. 3 brief thoughts from me to set the stage and what we're seeing from BCG's standpoint, and then we'll get into it. So the first being that deeper decarbonization in the world's grids, in the industrial facilities, homes, businesses, and transportation systems only works if we can deploy energy storage solutions en masse and with competitive economics. The second point being that some of you may have just come from the distributed solar conversation, which served as a nice lead-in on this discussion for energy storage, given co-location with renewable energy assets is one of the primary use cases. But then again, it's only one of more than a dozen broad use cases requiring gigawatts worth of new energy storage annually as we electrify. And then the third point being that unlike energy storage for passenger vehicles, which are mainly standardizing around a couple formats of lithium-ion batteries and eventually possibly fuel cells, we're seeing a much wider range of solutions being brought forward to address different stationary energy storage needs. And it is this final point that is made evident by the panel that's joining me today to discuss energy storage, who I'll introduce shortly. Before doing that, just wanted to give a brief agenda for the discussion here. We'll start with introductions of 2 minutes by each panelist of their respective businesses. I'll then tee up a handful of questions on technology, economic, and policy landscapes, and then we'll close with some Q&A from the audience. Again, thanks for being here. So with that, I now want to formally welcome Charlie, Daniel, Luke, and Simon to the panel. I'll provide quick introductions for them alphabetically. So Charlie Blair has been innovating energy systems for over 15 years, working with technologies that are on their way to major market growth and disrupting the traditional power and heat sectors. Charlie is currently the managing director of UK-based Gravitricity Limited, a company developing a pioneering grid-scale mechanical engineering storage technology, which shares many of the best attributes of lithium batteries and pump storage. Daniel Buhagiar is the CEO and co-founder of FLASC BV, a startup with a unique energy storage solution for offshore applications. He is a mechanical engineer and holds a PhD from the University of Malta, during which he developed FLASC's patented hydropneumatic energy storage technology. And FLASC recently won the prestigious Best Innovation Award at Offshore Energy 2020. Luke Sperrin is the co-founder and CTO of H2Go Power, a spin-out from the University of Cambridge, developing a hydrogen storage technology portfolio for energy storage. Luke's role oversees the development of zero-emission solid-state hydrogen storage and hydrogen AI solutions, along with market strategies and deployment of commercial projects. And Luke has over 10 years of R&D experience in hydrogen and fuel cell materials. And last but not least, Simon has 25 years of experience in technology and business innovation. He leads Moixa's overall strategy and growth plans and market relations across government, industry, and investors. He founded Moixa for smart energy R&D, as well as launched USB Cell in 2006 and co-created a financial e-commerce new business unit while with Accenture's technology practice. He has a MA in natural sciences and theoretical physics from Cambridge University, and is a member of the Smart Systems Forum supporting BEIS and Ofgem to review the UK flexibility strategy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Charlie, please, to give a 2-minute introduction of his company.
Super, thanks very much, and great to be here. Gordon, I think you're pushing slides on, so if you jump straight on. Super, thank you. My name's Charlie Blair. As said, I am MD and one of the 3 co-founders of Gravitricity Limited. Very briefly, we use gravity to store electricity. So as I said, the same physics as pumped hydro, but rather than fluids and pumps, we're using solid weights. We lift a weight to charge the system, lower a weight back down a underground vertical shaft to discharge electricity back to the grid. Very, very big global electricity storage market. That $620 billion market up until 2040 comes from BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Other panelists may mention it. Our bit of that, and I strongly believe that there are lots and lots of different segments within that market, all needing potentially different technologies. Our beachhead market is existing mine shafts. Obviously, if the hole in the ground is already there, it's going to be cheaper. We're working in across Europe, South Africa, Chile, Australia, anywhere where there's deep mining. Longer term and possibly more exciting for the real global energy transition is deploying long life energy storage exactly where storage is required. And that can completely change the way the electricity grid is deployed across Africa, across other continents where we don't currently have grid. So I do think storage has a role to play, not just on existing grids, but allowing more renewables onto these grids. But if we could build new grids with storage built into them, and that has to be long life storage, then those grids can look different. Briefly, next slide, Gordon. Really quickly, so far we've been simulating our system on all sorts of computer simulations, understanding costs and so on. I'm very pleased to say we're now building a big, heavy installation, 250 kilowatts, being deployed as we speak here in Edinburgh. The next project is a full-scale project in a European mine shaft. And we are currently raising a Series A round, 2.5 million. So if there are EIS, family offices, impact investors in the audience, please get in touch and please ask questions. Looking forward to a good discussion then.
Next up, Daniel.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me. There we go. So I'm Daniel. I'm a co-founder and CEO of FLASC PV. We're a startup based at the Buhagiar accelerator in Delft in the Netherlands, although we're actually a spin-off from the University of Malta. We are developing a unique energy storage technology designed to improve grid integration by delivering offshore wind on demand or other sources of offshore renewable energy. Basically, the technology uses seawater and compressed air to store energy in a safe and sustainable manner, using the ocean itself as an efficient natural heat sink, which is crucial when you're working with compressed air or compressed gases. The system has a lifetime that can reach more than 3 times that of conventional lithium-ion batteries, and we're targeting a much cheaper total cost of ownership. It's designed for co-location within the, for example, offshore wind farm footprint to deliver flexibility on the hourly to daily time scale. We also see that it can be an excellent fit in supporting large-scale green hydrogen production. You can go to the next slide, please. So this is our TRL-5 prototype, which we deployed in Malta and the Mediterranean. The campaign was concluded in 2019, and this was a crucial early stage validation for the technology. We actually, following this campaign, we got a statement of feasibility from the MVGL and becoming essentially one of the first offshore dedicated energy storage solutions to receive this stamp of approval. We have an EU-funded TRL-7 project that's already in progress. This will see the deployment of a multi-use offshore platform with a floating wind turbine, integrated energy storage, and also a desalination system. Here we're targeting small islands, such as, for example, in this case, in Greece. Finally, FLASC has attracted the interest already of a range of global players, from offshore wind farm developers to oil and gas operators looking to decarbonize. Last year, we secured a strategic collaboration with Subsea 7. They are a market leader in oil and gas and renewable energy offshore project delivery. And this will essentially accelerate our path to market in line with, let's say, the growing demands of an offshore sector in the midst of an accelerating green transition. And I'll also plug our fundraising round. So we're in the process of opening a Series A. So any potentially interested investors, of course, please get in touch. Thank you.
Next up, Luke.
Hello, thanks for the very kind introduction. I'm Luke, I'm the CTO of H2Go Power. At H2Go Power, we create intelligent and autonomous systems that store hydrogen at low pressures in a safe and efficient and cost-effective manner. We believe this is the missing link in the industry that will accelerate the usage of hydrogen to help solve the climate crisis. Our technology, sorry, if you go back a slide, our technology utilizes chemistry to store hydrogen safely, locking it up in materials and avoiding the problems that come with high pressure cylinders and low temperature liquefaction. Not needing to compress hydrogen means that we can store hydrogen at a third of today's prices and reach near 100% storage efficiency. We have combined our storage technology with electrolyzers and fuel cells to create a hydrogen battery, which can last 3 times longer than today's batteries, and we can reach a cost point of half of today's batteries. Next slide, please. We have a hydrogen storage technology portfolio that covers mobility and large-scale energy storage. We are applying our technology in the hydrogen drone market to achieve 3 times the range over conventional batteries whilst avoiding the need for high-pressure tanks. We have successfully demonstrated a commercial pilot and flight test, which was featured on the BBC. Sorry, next previous slide. We have the hydrogen storage module that stores 1 kilogram of hydrogen at pressures less than your coffee machine. These then stuck into a shipping container to form a utility scale storage, and with the addition of an electrolyzer and fuel cell make up a hydrogen battery. These systems are then controlled by an AI-driven hydrogen management system that takes in data about the storage environment and coordinates the best response. Next slide, please. We are trialing this hydrogen management system called HiAI in Scotland, which takes in inputs such as prices, weather, and renewable generation, and then decides the best output to meet electricity grid and hydrogen export demands. It means hydrogen can be directly controlled and directed into the electricity or gas grid or for mobility. Next slide, please. We will soon be launching our crowdfunding campaign on Crowdcube and encourage you to register to help grow the hydrogen revolution.
Okay, and then Simon, please.
Hi, I'm Simon Daniel, founder of Moixa. We're interested in managing the world's batteries using software to coordinate how batteries charge and discharge and deliver grid services. Next slide. And we've been obviously in the last few years focused on kind of domestic energy storage, including making our own integrated batteries in Europe and developing out our software to really optimize those assets. And we've now started deploying our software at scale with third-party batteries globally, notably with Tochu in Japan. We have over 27,000 batteries using our software there, nearly a third of a gigawatt hour, the largest virtual power plant in the world of connected residential storage. And we're now deploying our software also to smart charge electric vehicles through a partnership with Honda in Europe. Next slide. And so what we look at is really optimizing a battery to multiple different characteristics behind the meter, whether it's weather, time of use, carbon, resilience, and then enterprise tools to manage large groups of battery assets to really make them look like a grid side container storage or larger scale grid asset. And then we deploy these into flexibility markets by sort of trading and grouping and dispatching and using various AI technologies to coordinate the whole thing. We have quite a lot of patents dating back to 2008, cited by many hundreds of US and global companies. Next slide. And if you just do one on to animate if that's going. So this is an example in Japan showing how a group of a quarter gigawatt hour batteries connects and charges over the day. This is typically storing solar energy or pushing solar to the grid for feed-in tariff reasons, and demonstrates how you can kind of manage large fleets of connected batteries to look like a grid scale battery. And we're very interested in using this to control even larger fleets into electric vehicles. Next slide. And so we tend to work with kind of the supply side battery companies, electric vehicle companies, and then manage and optimize solutions for households with utility partners to create behind the meter value, and then work with utilities to support their trading, and then work with grid services to support local management of constraints and upstream. And so that's a sort of snapshot of what we do with our software side, and to connect large, effectively millions of batteries to deliver sort of additional grid services in support of shifting renewable energy around the day. Thank you.
All right, well, again, welcome panelists, and we've already covered a lot of ground here. So I'd say the overall objective of this session is to really walk away with greater conviction that we're not still waiting for a miracle in energy storage to help us accelerate to net zero. The solutions are known, and yet there's also still a ton of hard work ahead to scale the various technologies and drive adoption. So to do that, providing you with greater conviction, I think we'll need to touch on 3 legs of the stool. One being that the tech is available and proven. 2, that the solutions are economically competitive today and or in the near future. And 3, that the policy support that is needed to go further, faster is quite sensible. So first question for the group here is related to technology. And when it comes to technology challenges, most of what actually gets talked about today relates to energy density. But what is another technical limitation for energy storage that you believe is not getting talked about enough? And why is that relevant?
I'm happy to jump in on this one, Nathan.
Please, Charlie. Yeah.
What often people talk about, so for a start, energy density, incidentally, I think all the technology companies here are interested in grid scale storage rather than vehicles. So energy density is much less important. I think it's really not a challenge. It's one of many reasons I actually think why lithium batteries should primarily and will primarily be in cars, and we'll use different technologies for grid scale, but that's a separate question. Technology challenge that I think is the missing link for grid scale stuff is lifetime. That's both cycle life and shelf life. I just simply do not think we will carry on deploying technology that has a cycle life in the thousands, not tens of thousands, and a shelf life in less than a decade when we're talking about electricity grid infrastructure. And I think that is a major change that we're already seeing. And it's why mechanical technologies are having, there's still a hell of a lot of interest in there. And lots of utilities don't think that lithium batteries are just going to solve all the challenges. So that doesn't mean making lithium batteries last a long time. In my opinion, it means use other alternative technologies alongside lithium. It's not one or the other, it's both.
Great. I saw lots of nodding heads. Anyone else want to add to Charlie's point?
I fully agree. I mean, it's the same. It's also something that we set about with when we started thinking about alternative ways of storing energy and looking specifically at offshore. But it was, I think, one of the earliest validations we got when talking to potential clients that are, for example, oil and gas operators. The idea of a consumable technology that has, as we're saying, this type of lifetime in the order of thousands of cycles that may need to be replaced, not exactly sure how long it will last. This in our sector, let's say it's a major deal breaker. Just also the unpredictability of the lifetime. So what we're doing with our technology is basically using established subcomponents that are, have a predictable lifetime. You have standard maintenance and it can last for, let's say 30 plus years. And you can guarantee that because the lifetime is irrespective of the charging and discharging cycle and the modes of operation.
Great.
So there are a couple of factors which I think are quite pertinent. One is what affects the location of the storage. If you put something centrally, you can do central things with that. If you put something at the edge, you can do many more things with an edge product. The second and probably most important thing is carbon. So quite a lot of the focus in the last few years has been on the falling cost curve of lithium and other chemistries following the same solar trajectory that you're going to end up with, ever decreasing prices. And those prices tend to be even cheaper than recycled or your second life batteries. But the carbon cost per cycle needs to become a key metric. So if you make something with lithium, if you've got good longevity, then you get a better carbon cost per cycle. If you make it in the wrong place in the world, you might have a high carbon. If you mine things inefficiently or need rare earths in a certain way, so you end up kind of looking at carbon question, you may end up shifting from lithium to sodium to other more abundant materials and considering the carbon cost per cycle rather than just the dollar cost per cycle. This is really critical if you're trying to displace other kind of carbon heavy technologies from the grid. And originally, for example, when you made solar, you had a 50 gram per kilowatt of solar over its lifetime. And solar's got more efficient. It's low grams per carbon per kilowatt over lifetime, but it's still high if you make that solar panel in the wrong place. So thinking through the carbon costs is really essential. And certainly lithium has its carbon cost in it. If you dig tunnels in the ground, that has a carbon cost to it, but it has great longevity. And so you've got to look at the overall question. If you make something with lots and lots of metal, then you've got to think about that. So ultimately, if you've got lots of different energy choices, and they're all getting pretty cheap, and you might have density considerations if you put things in drones, but beyond that, yes, vehicles, density important, but then it comes down to price. Everything's going to get cheaper. but then it's the carbon price and the location. If you can't flood each home, you need to think about other things which work at the grid edge.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all the panelists before me. Like they said, we've grown used to sort of batteries. We seem to be okay with the phone and our batteries running out really quickly, dying after 10 years. Really, we need to be talking about tens of thousands of cycles. The only other thing I wanted to raise was storage duration. So we are focused on storing for short periods of time. So we really need to be looking at 8 hours or longer. And I think that was highlighted with the disaster in Texas, where they obviously were without power for long periods. And I mean, those events are going to become more prevalent, and we need to think of ways of storing energy for long periods of time, so many hours and days and weeks, so seasonal storage as well, just on the back of that.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for covering the wider landscape of technical challenges there. And given there are so many different storage technologies, can we really actually get all of those to proper business cases? Or will we need to see some convergence towards a few technologies and solutions that can get certified, scaled, and matured more quickly? Be curious if you're on your points for that. I mean,
there is a major barrier to new technologies in the sense that the world needs hundreds of gigawatt hours, terawatt hours of new battery capacity. And so it does take a while to spin up a new chemistry from the lab in MIT through to something you can put a 100 gigawatt hour factory or gigafactories in the ground. There's billions of dollars of capital and time and assurance is required. So there is a barrier to entry in suddenly getting from lab to scale and getting the capital to do that. And therefore, the financing world tends to prefer last decade's technology. And that's sort of the challenge facing any new technology getting penetration. If you go back 20 years to clean tech, we're a clean tech winner for the last couple of years. But 15 years ago, there were lots of grid scale storage companies and there's sort of hundreds of different technologies, but they're all potentially very good. But it takes a long time to get from lab through Series A to Series DE, and then to actually get into the roadmap for scale. And that's the challenge perennially in this sector.
Yeah, and Simon, even I'd add on top of that even when you get there, if you're then competing with a technology that's been through the cycles of cost reduction, because there's gigawatt hours deployed, it makes it all the more difficult. All of that said, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing unless we thought there was lots of space for other technologies. And I think it's something to be learned from transitions in energy systems. We are moving from centralized technology where there is one basically thermal technology, it's a steam turbine, to a global energy systems that are different across the board. There'll be lots of different types of flexibility. It's not just storage, and there'll be lots of different requirements for storage on grids in vehicles. And really there is so much demand for storage, whether it's in vehicles or on grids, that there has to be space for all these other technologies. But I'm convinced there are 4 companies here that all have future models. I'm very convinced there's space for alternative technologies. And I think, to be honest, anyone working in the lithium battery industry would agree with that. It's just no one can quite tell exactly which ones are going to succeed.
Yeah, from our perspective, sorry.
Go ahead, Luke.
So I mean, in the best case, hydrogen's only going to make up 24% of our energy in 2050. So I mean, I see there's multiple technologies that will exist in different spaces and niches. I mean, cost will be the major driver for large-scale energy storage, but it'll be defined based on geographical location and other factors. So yeah, there's more than enough space for many different technologies. Yeah.
Sometimes the way we look at it is actually looking at the generation technology. So if we look at solar, which is now, of course, an extremely mainstream technology, all the way up to floating wind, which is still in the prototyping and piloting stage, although in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of traction there. So sometimes the way we look at it is also that there will be technologies that are well established, that are meeting, let's say, some of the most immediate or straightforward applications, but then it's ultimately a mix of technologies that will be kind of covering the whole spectrum of what is required. And as Charlie said, the challenge is when you're coming in with, let's say, the floating wind of the storage space and you're competing with the solar. Of course, solar is much cheaper, but doesn't mean that there isn't space for a range of technologies. So that's also a bit how we look at it on our side, targeting specifically the offshore sector. It's going to take some more time to develop, but I think the coming decade is going to represent some very exciting opportunities for that.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm smiling, but when you said that, of course, you're competing with solar because solar is really cheap. I've been around doing this for 20 years, and I worked in solar when I first graduated. It was comically expensive then, and no one could have dreamed that you would be saying that solar was cheaper than any other technology. It was basically straight off satellites. And there is this amazing ability for technologies to come down a cost curve and improve their efficiency, improve other things. What we need to do is get technologies to the point where they're commercial and moving down that curve. And that's sometimes easier said than done, and valley of death and all these things. But we're all entrepreneurs, and we'll make it through those, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's a great lead in perhaps to the next question, just as where within the value chain of each of your individual solutions do you still feel that there's the biggest need to change the economics and go down the cost curve?
So there's a couple of things around really shared value chains or vertically integrated companies. So there's been a lot of kind of consolidation in the energy storage and software space. So effectively you need to, if you want to sell a lithium battery, it needs to come with software in order for that to deliver flexibility service to the grid. And so that's really quite important. The other thing is, the ultimate kind of cost of a battery is free if it's properly shared. And so we do a lot of work with electric vehicles, and the UK has currently 10 gigawatt hours of distributed batteries in vehicles today, and is on a trajectory to be 800 gigawatt hours of batteries in electric vehicles. So you could argue those batteries are free for grid services if they're bought for the purpose of mobility. But if you get money from sharing that to the grid to deliver grid services, that can increase the economics, create a virtuous circle, which means they're cheaper in the cars, which means the cars are cheaper, which means people who like making cars can carry on making cars with electric vehicles in. So you've really got to manage lots of different connected assets and share the value. If you have a battery in a home, you want it to work with the neighbor to support their car charging. You want to work with the local solar farm to store their solar off-peak to push it at peak hours. You want to work with the grid for balancing and deliver all these upstream services. And recognizing there will be terawatt hours of batteries in the global EV fleets in every country, that constitutes a very large, predictable growing reserve of chemistry to be managed for increased return. If you take a single use case in one location on the grid, that tends to be more challenging because you need to look at whether that location will always have the value and the economics, or whether the regulatory model changes. So we consider creating vertical integrated or sharing economies such that assets can be properly shared, particularly in the electrochemical space, but also goes into other kinds of technology in peer sharing. If you've got a fuel-based vehicle, is that vehicle being used for multiple different participants over its lifespan?
I was just going to add, in terms of hydrogen, we're really at a stage where we want to make a lot of devices very cheaply and on a large scale. So it's all about the manufacturing. So being able to create stacks in large quantities and very quickly. So we sort of need a gigafactory for the hydrogen side of things now. So I would say that's the big stepping stone for the hydrogen industry.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our technology has different sorts of ways of getting costs down. The materials are inherently cheap. There's nothing expensive in there. It's some steel, but it's clever steel is the issue. So we need to get the fabrication, manufacturing costs down. Winches are valuable things. So and our plan is not to do it all ourselves. It's big, heavy engineering technology that we're working on. Our plan is very clearly to work with existing players, and those existing players are excited by this capability to actually step their sales of individual winch drums up in many orders of magnitude. So for us, it's not so much about supply chain as integration of existing technologies in the right sorts of ways and enabling the cost reductions from manufacturing scale.
Yeah, in our case, it's also, I think, quite a specific challenge, the cost reduction and let's say also the value maximization, or how we frame that value. On the cost reduction side, again, we're also using, let's say, established subcomponents and working with key players that have their own technologies that they've been doing for the past 30, 40 years. So we're basically integrating storage within that. In our case, a particular challenge is the offshore mindset. So we are targeting initially oil and gas applications. That's an interesting beachhead. That's an extremely risk-averse sector with very high safety factors because the risk of any form of failure is catastrophic. So in our case, one of the things we promote is inherently safe materials. So it's also important that then the design is reflecting the fact that you're using much safer materials. So you can have a much more efficient and optimized design from a materials perspective. So that's one of our key challenges, to shift the mindset and make things simpler and also cheaper. On the value side, I think it's important to get clients thinking beyond CapEx. So one of the things that you're often compared with is the cell cost of a lithium-ion battery, the 100 or 150 euro per kilowatt hour. So there's more to a storage system than that, and there needs to be more metrics to reflect the total cost of ownership in the correct way, or the levelized cost of storage. And also, as Simon mentioned earlier, some form of carbon footprint label or some form of way of quantifying the carbon impact of the storage technology that essentially ties into the whole sustainability aspect of why we're in the midst of an energy transition.
And jumping on one of the questions from the audience, for each of your end customer or industries, what is the magic number that you would say, whether it be CapEx, OpEx, some other metric? What are you actually trying to drive towards? And do you see that being one that is already competitive today across the board, or is it still requiring a little bit more time to get there?
I think CapEx is always a magic number, and that's something that clean energy technologies that have a high upfront cost and then no fuel cost have always suffered from, and therefore if you discount with even anything above a sort of 1 or 2% discount rate, you're suffering from your longevity. So for us, the long cycle life is the easy bit. Then it's persuading people to take a levelized cost of storage view rather than a single upfront cost per megawatt or per megawatt hour view. But I say persuading people, plenty of people in the project finance and in the utility world like it are thinking.
Yeah, they're getting smarter and smarter to be able to use that number. That's right.
But it's the levelized cost of storage, and then the question is, what's your discount rate and how long a lifetime are you doing? How many cycles are you including in your calculation? So comparing oranges with oranges is famously difficult, but I think it's a mistake to try and do it using only one magic number, to be quite honest, because you'll always end up with different answers.
But yeah, I mean, CapEx in sort of residential batteries and EVs is important. It obviously favors geographies with low interest rates. We sell tens and tens of thousands of batteries in Japan to our partners because there's a very low cost of credit. The other factor there is the security of income from grid services. So if you have a strong S-chip or Con Edison program in California, which pays an assured income, you can use that to asset fund a special purpose vehicle, which is in effect the feed-in tariff model for solar in the last presentation, and why third-party ownership of solar in America is very, very significant. Multiple billions into the sector. So if you know that you've got secure income for grid services, which are otherwise merchant and variable, which depends on your next question on policy, then that creates a sort of way to fund things over time as energy, as storage kind of models. But if you have uncertain income, then you need your bankers to have PhDs in mathematics to work out how to fund it. And in general, the challenge is when you had a government-backed income like feed-in tariff, which is one number, it was very, very simple for finance to say, okay, secure income done, here's $1 billion. Where you've got an income stack dependent on like 30 different balancing things and words like flexibility, balancing, frequency, it's kind of just too complicated for most sort of simple finance models. But in practice, it's much better because you can trade the same thing multiple times. And the way you trade it is different. There was a famous case when Denora was refinanced in the UK. This is an 8 gigawatt hour hydro plant. We knew one of the finance guys who subsequently became a venture capitalist, but he did the business case for it, saying it makes 30 million a year on trading services, and it still does every year make the same amount of money or whatever, or 300 million, I can't remember the number. But what it does today is just different contracts to what it did 40, 50 years ago. So it still makes the same amount of income. The contracts have completely changed to different kinds of things, and it's reasonably secure. But explaining that when you try to fund it would be incredibly complicated, which is one of the challenges facing the gravity models. You have to say what's secure, and at the end of the day, it comes down to phasing things at different times in the future. I can cover a bit on the policy side, but certainly if you know something is stable for the next 10 years and what it does with feed-in tariff for incomes, you can do that model. If you know the world needs X terawatt hours of long cycle storage in 2030 or 2040 to meet net zero targets, you can say, okay, here's a chunk of money to fulfill the net zero target in 2040, and here's the technologies which are on a 2040 trajectory to get there. And so things are kind of predictable if you take a 30, 40 year net zero roadmap, and lithium wins this decade. Electric vehicle clearly will have multiple terawatt hours of stuff is being ordered, and therefore that's going to sort of win the first wave. Certainly improving technologies and wind to get them time agnostic makes wind even better in the short term. Jumping into next decade and the decade after, things you can put into planning permission, such as you build buildings and cities with gravity if that works, or hydrogen economies start to become really exciting in 2020, 40 decade. And therefore kind of working backwards from the goal of 2050 of net zero. And if you've got $1 trillion a year to spend on these technologies, you can say, okay, we're going to be spending $640 billion according to one slide on these technologies in 2040 in order to get to the goal. And these things are kind of quite predictable in that long-term viewpoint.
One other question I want to ask from the audience here is, we haven't mentioned China yet, and it's great to see that all the companies you represent are based in Europe. Is there a role for China here? Is it something that we rely on them either as demand or supply centers, or is this something that can be more grown as a local regional ecosystem?
I mean, there's definitely, I mean, there's a very good Economist article about the sort of geopolitics of energy going forward, and certainly Asia and in particular China has kind of secured most of the kind of lithium-based supply chains, and so it's very, very significant in the global supply chain for lithium and for other related chemistries, particularly rare earths, and also what China does in its own energy policy. And so, ironically, the UK, appointed Hinkley, for example, as nuclear. And so HM government gave approval of Hinkley as nuclear technology. Doesn't matter whether Hinkley's built, but the world is now nuclear because China will build lots of nuclear power plants because UK government signed it off. And the world, so if you take that kind of round view, so what China does is really, really important to the forward model, because China has to have clean air and it has good supply chain and is really important in the overall scheme of things. And so, they obviously have a large share of the battery market today and need pretty critical in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, they really have sort of taken some of this hydrogen technology forward. They've deployed many hydrogen projects way before our side of the world. I think just because they saw the immediate sort of business attractiveness and also the harm they were doing, they really sort of threw themselves into these hydrogen projects. And I think they're very keen on achieving these technologies at industrial scale. Yeah.
Good. Another policy question. So what is your #1 practical ask for policymakers in terms of facilitating growth in energy storage? For example, whether it be expedited permitting, standardized protocols, you name it. Like what is not the I need billions of dollars of funding, but maybe make it more tangible. That'd be helpful for the audience.
Yeah, well, the thing I'd say is, and it comes back to this lifetime thing, I would say do not stop, but through your rules and regulations, the people on building electricity grids who have a low cost of money, and that's regulated utilities, from building infrastructure assets, which can be storage. So this is a very sort of specific play that Ofgem, the UK regulator, has said that they're minded to not allow power companies, utilities to own storage assets. And I think that is a massive mistake. And it sort of precludes anyone with a long view of the world, a low cost of money, from getting involved. And the UK is kind of going backwards and getting stuck in a rut of short-term asset thinking rather than long-term infrastructure thinking as a result of that. I would stress, and I'm pretty sure everyone will stress, that we don't need, the storage markets do not need grant. What they need is regulations allowing players to fit in ways that make sense, because actually it's a no-brainer that we need flexibility in storage. We just don't overcomplicate lots of those markets is the other half of that.
Yeah, I think policy which allows you to do things rather than stops you is important. So certainly the historic approaches, you set a policy based around what worked last decade. So there's storage for the grid, which looks like pumped hydro and 24-hour longevity, or don't allow DNOs to own storage. Whereas the USA has FERC regulation, which allows any asset to participate if it likes to the best of its technical abilities, not being constrained to say it must deliver packets of load or energy demand in certain predetermined ways by the market. So that kind of policy will lead to innovation. We have a kind of a slight counter view that because exponential technology just works, there will be 250 million connected electric vehicles in the world by 2030. Nothing's going to stop that. And so the technologies enable us to turn that on and off. Regulation is not going to get in our way, and therefore regulation will be in catch-up mode. And so at the end of the day, regulation can just step out of the way because technology is going to move far faster than policy makers expect. But if they block something, then that's kind of an issue, because you do get then delays within locations where a country becomes less competitive because they've got outdated rules, and that's kind of probably a challenge. The permitting and things like that is kind of a challenge to technologies. Moixa won an energy storage demonstrator of 40 from DEC about 7 or 8 years ago, and 4 of the technologies were then put into pilot, including one of ours. And we finished our project of distributed assets by the time the other 3 projects have actually got their permitting. And so there's certainly a rolling speed of distributed assets versus large scale things which take longer to set up. However, if you work a net zero policy to 2050 and say that's okay because we just need to order certain power capability for 2030, it's going to take time. But there's things you can do quickly, fast moving goods. There's things which take slow, and sometimes these regulations or permits are there for valid reasons because a lot of environmental and other factors involved need to be assessed.
Well, unfortunately, I will need to wrap us up. I think we were really just getting started and had a number of excellent questions that we weren't able to address. But with that, did want to say thank you again to the panelists. On behalf of them, I'm sure they would love if you would reach out to them directly for any other further inquiries. And wanted to thank the audience here for their attendance and engagement.
Thank you. Really is a very lively and insightful panel. Maybe next year when we have this event again, we can invite all of you to come back and then you guys can update us on the progress. Really great. And I think that's a really good way to conclude our 4-day conference, because even though we talk about different things, different topics on different panels, I think essentially storage has been on everyone's mind. We all know that it's part of the process to get us to that transition. And so today we can finally dive deeper into discussing what can make this happen. And so really great panel. Before I let everyone in the audience go, can I just ask everyone to stay here for 1 more minute and fill in the survey that we have prepared for you. Our team has worked incredibly hard in the past 3 months to make this happen. And so your feedback will be very important in helping us make this even better for next year. And then alongside that, actually, I don't know if you guys know, our Master of Operation is actually located in Tokyo. Tak, if you could say hi to everyone. Tak has been spending the last few days staying up until 4 or 5 in Tokyo, helping us manage the Zoom and all the logistics. And so hopefully after today, you can finally get some sleep. In the same note, Miles has been helping Tak and also to prepare the first day panel. Yesterday, we have Sebastian and Rasak on the Middle Eastern panel. And today, of course, we have Gordon and Alberto. Really a great job, everyone. This would not have been possible without you. One last person that I really would like to thank before closing this conference is Karan. Karan, are you here? Well, while we are bringing Karan on the stage, Karan is a MBA 2020. He has since graduated, but he was the GS leader for last year. We actually have been spending the past 18 months putting this event together. And it was really helpful to have the foundation that Karan has helped lay down. And again, this would not have been possible without all of your help. With that said, we're very grateful. We hope to see you again next year, and we hope that you have enjoyed this content. And please, before you go, do fill out a survey. And I wish everyone a good evening and good morning. Bye-bye.